Hi, welcome back. Thanks for joining me today. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, John writes that God is love. This is a simple and yet profound description of the nature of God. Human redemption is about the story of God's love being proven for us in the form of Jesus at the cross. When it comes to God's love, however, there's a distorted view that people frequently have about it. For example, without question, God loves us. In the golden text of the Bible, in John chapter 3 and verse 16, Jesus declared, "For God so loved the world." There's no doubt that God loves you and I. He loves the human family. However, this love that He has for us is not blanketed approval for how we live. A lot of people think that God's love grants them the freedom to live a life without constraint, a life without rules, a life without consequence, that He will accept us despite our unwillingness to live according to His love. And then there's others who are just confused about love altogether and think that love is lust. For example, a wife may go to her husband and tell him how she has fallen in love with another man. They'll divorce and their family will crumble. Well, she didn't fall in love with another man. That's not love. That's lust. Lust destroys. Love builds up. Love brings peace and harmony. But what about God's love? Instead of dealing with distortions, what is the truth about God's love? What does the Bible have to say about God's love and the nature of God's love? Well, first of all, God's love is sacrificial. His love is not just some spoken words or sentiment, but has been proven through the sacrificial death of His Son. God gave us His Son. In John chapter 3 and verse 16, that's what Jesus says, "For God so loved the world that He gave." That is emphasizing the self-giving nature of God's love. He's given something to us for our good. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 8, Paul says that God shows His love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You and I were undeserving of what God gave us in the form of His Son. And of course, that sacrificial nature of God's love is supposed to do something. It's supposed to elicit a response within us. More about that in a minute. Secondly, God's love is relational. Of course, love by nature is about a relationship. In 1 John chapter 3, in verse 1, John says, "Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God." John sometimes is referred to as the apostle of love. This is due to the extensive way he writes about the subject in these letters. He calls us to focus upon it. We need to think about God's love and the consequence, what it seeks to do for us. God does not just want to make us His servants. He wants to make us His children. He wants to bless us with good things. He wants to bless us with an inheritance. Of course, an inheritance is only given to those who are part of the family. It's about having a relationship. God's sacrificial love is about Him trying to unite us, to reconcile us to Him through the death of His Son. Well, this brings us to our third and final point today about the love of God. God's love is intended to be reciprocated. God's love is intended to be reciprocated. Of course, you cannot have a relationship without there being action that is reciprocated. In 1 John chapter 4, in verse 19, John says, "We love Him because He first loved us." God's love demands a response. It seeks a response of love. It's His sacrificial, self-giving love seeks a sacrificial and self-giving response within us, that we would be willing to sacrifice sin and selfishness to faithful service to Him. In 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3, Jesus says, "For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome." God's love expects that we would keep his commandments. That's how we reciprocate our love for him. That's how we show him our love for him. That passage alone should dispel this distortion that people have, that God's love grants them a life without rules. Oh, what about these rules? What about these commands? John here says that his commands are not burdensome. His commands are given for our good. They're intended to help us in life. They're intended to protect us in life, to protect us from things that are dangerous and destructive to our eternal salvation. They're designed to bless us and to bless the world through our influence and godly example. We're to show our love, reciprocate our love for God by loving our neighbor. By loving our neighbor as ourselves. We demonstrate our love for our fellow man by seeking to tell them, to show them, to teach them about God's love, about the sacrificial nature of it, about what God has done for them through Jesus and what that means in the world, what that means personally to them in their lives. God's love has transformed our life, and we should be seeking to use God's love to transform the lives of others. Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope this brief video has been helpful in you gaining a better understanding of God's love, and hopefully a better understanding of God's love will spur us on to greater devotion to keeping his commandments and sharing that love with other people. Thank you, and have a nice day.